Hello and welcome to the Rogue Monkey podcast and episode 107. Our show is all about sharing inspirational stories of successful people who have encountered challenge in their life, with changes of direction that they could not have anticipated. It is these changes of direction that we can take wisdom from, and today's discussion could not embody that more. My guest today is Rich Christiansen. He is a globally recognised thought leader, educator, mentor, parallel entrepreneur, and humanitarian. He assists people in fearlessly facing their dragons, making peace with them, and navigating the intricate mazes of their lives. Rich's story, both personally and professionally, is incredible, and there is so much to take from this conversation about navigating life's curveballs. Just before we dive into the interview, please make sure you hit subscribe however you're joining us today. And after you listen to our conversation, we would love you to share it with one person you would think would take a lot from it. With that, let's get into our conversation and episode 107 as we speak to Rich Christiansen. Hello, Rich, and welcome to the Rogue Monkey podcast. How are we doing today?
Great to hear from you, and what a great name, the Rogue Monkey.
Well, it was rooted in people's lives that perhaps take a slightly different turn to what they expected, which is, I guess, where we're going to go today. But for the uninitiated and people who have not crossed paths with you before, do you want to give our listeners and viewers just a bit of an introduction as to who you are and a bit of your backstory?
Oh, my heck, I'm happy to do that, but I hate to blow my own horn, but I have lived just a remarkable life. Oftentimes people introduce me as Rich as like 170 years old in life experience. I ran several of the largest companies in the U.S., so I had the corporate experience and then got very frustrated with the corporate world, and I went to become one of the Lean Startup Entrepreneur Precipice authors. I wrote Zigzag Principle, which was one of the foundational books of the Lean Startup movement, and have now co-founded 51 businesses, 19 failures, 17 multi-million-dollar wins. So that's kind of what I'm known for. And I think that this content that I'm coming out with now will actually kind of shock everyone.
Well, let's go back a little bit to where that all started, because people just hearing those stats there about the business success, you know, where did all of that begin for you? Because I think often we see the headlines, but perhaps we don't dive into the backstory a little bit. So for you, where did that journey of entrepreneurship and chasing startups and that passion for business kind of come about?
You know, Kevin, it was actually in my DNA. Literally, I couldn't help myself, and I thought I was the weirdest little, I'll use the word monkey because we're talking about monkeys, but the weirdest little monkey that ever walked Earth, because it was not in my family. My father was very logical. He was blind, as we'll get to, and an attorney, eidetic memory, so logic pure, but I could not help myself. At the age of 5, I'm selling candles. At the age of 6, I'm selling night crawlers. At the age of 8, I'm hustling. I was just a natural born hustler, and I couldn't stop it. You just as well could have told you not to grow out that beard you got going on right there as not do this. And so it was just in my DNA to hustle and create businesses. And it wasn't until I was, 53, 54 years old, I fully understood where that came from. But that was the backstory of how I became an entrepreneur.
And that, I guess, journey is full of adversity and grit and all of the kind of things that are required if you're going to be successful in that space. And I guess some of that you probably were absorbing long before you were even aware of what some of those traits were.
Oh.
So let's go back to, I guess, the early years of your childhood, and what were those first few experiences like? Yeah, I know you mentioned there your dad was blind, and obviously the incredible journey he went on to forge the career path that he did. You know, that kind of, I guess, osmosis of human traits coming across to you.
Yeah. Maybe if I could just even tell his story real briefly, because I think it's so relevant. My grandparents, in the middle of the Great Depression, were homesteading and living in a little one-room log cabin that didn't even have plumbing or a toilet. And so my father came into the world at 2 years old, discovered that he had retinoblastoma, which was cancer in his optic nerve. So they took his first eye, thinking, oh, it'll be okay. And then at the age of 4, they had to make the terrible decision. Do we take the second eye and only give him maybe a 1 in 20 chance of living, because it's still likely would die of cancer, or do we let him see and then die by the age of 8? And keeping in mind in that period in time, the only options for a blind child or a blind individual was to, one, work for the circus, or two, to become a professional beggar. So it was very bleak. My grandfather went out, and my father ended up obviously living, but he had an eidetic memory, which means that he could hear a number. If you were to quote a 7 or 8 or 9 digit number, he could recall that verbatim 30 years later. So I've known some of the most brilliant men on earth. No one even came close to my father. So that was my father. My mother was a beauty queen, 15 years his junior, multiple marriage proposals, but really wanted to marry an ideal, just really honorable man, which my father was, the most brilliant and honorable man I've ever met. And so I was the first child in that marriage. And so it was a very unique childhood, a beautiful childhood. Example is tying bells on my shoes so my father could find me. And being a little trickster, I would chase around the park and try to remove my shoes or stop so he couldn't find me. So it was a remarkable childhood, but also a very different childhood that most children face. An example is my father loved cars. My father couldn't tune the engine. So at age 5 years old, I'm in the engine tuning the carburetor with my dad giving me instructions. So it was a remarkably interesting and complicated childhood. I never really was a child. I was more an adult playing that transition role. The eyes for my father. My mother was very introverted, beautiful artist. So I was the articulation of my mother's art to my father's logic.
So now you reflect on that as an adult, and having had all those experiences you've had, what roles did some of those early experiences play in kind of how your life has now panned out?
Oh, that's a great question, actually. And I think it actually ended up being the gift that propelled me. A lot of times these very interesting opportunities that we get, we can look at them as hard or sad. And I don't do that. I look at it as amazing, because it's provided me with this super uncanny ability that I have now to look 5 steps ahead and then behind the corner and solve really complicated problems, or ability to articulate very complicated technology or very complicated structures. Or I'm very well known for being able to create structures or frameworks that other people can model and follow, whether it's in business or family. That all came out of a early childhood of being able to expose to some of these very interesting dynamics that most don't get the opportunity to.
So a little bit further down the line, I guess you obviously had the business opportunities and all those sorts of things, and you came to yet another crossroads in your life. And if we talk about, I guess, cultural norms or the historical approach of you get a job, you fall into a career, you have that until you retire, and you stay in a safe role. So you kind of went through that in those kind of corporate years, if you like, and then chose to take a step in a different direction. So what gave you the confidence to do that? And again, reflecting on that, why did you actually make that choice?
You're asking some great questions, Kevin. Thank you for digging this deeply. And it was actually, a lot of it was my wife. I was in the corporate world and being very successful in the corporate world, but it was an interrupt period where I realized if I kept going down that path, I would have been an Inc. 100 or Inc. 500 CEO, but I would have dramatically compromised the things that I was valuing in my life. It was actually over there in the United Kingdom, Dr. Peter Horn, that interrupted that. If I could tell that story quickly, would that be okay?
Absolutely.
I grew up in a little rural community here in the Western U.S., 2,000 of us if you count the cows, and I was so dead committed to get the brass ring to show I was the man that when I was given the opportunity at a young age to be general manager of a major world division, I was sleeping on the floor half the nights. I was traveling all over the world. I was just going crazy. And Dr. Horn actually called me over for a chat. And you can say it in your posh British accent. I can't very well. So it's a 22 and a half hour flight over. And I get to his office, and And this is the conversation he had. It was, Rich, we're delighted with the progress that you're having and making in the U.S. market. However, this is a personal visit. And I wanted to have this personal conversation. You can replace anything in your life. You can replace cars, jobs. You can replace money. You can replace anything. You cannot replace, number one, your health. Number two, your trust relationships. And most importantly, your family. Go home. And if you're in work the next 2 weeks, you're fired. And then he gave me the backhand swoosh, swoosh. You probably can't see it on the podcast, but backhanded swish me out. I had a very long 22 and a half hour flight home. Thinking of the crazy things I'd done. I'd been into India a couple of 3 years earlier and brought back pertussis and given it to we'd all been immunized, but somehow it got through. And I'm coughing, vomiting, probably need to be in the hospital, but so were my children. And my youngest child, at one point, I was off being Mr. Wonderful. And my wife had to take my little, at that time, like 6-month-old son to the hospital in the middle of the night, stop the car. And where was I? I wasn't there. So I raced home that night, got home about 5:30, picked up my beautiful little son, Nathan, who was about one and a half then. And he started screaming and pushing me away. And I realized that my son didn't even know who I was. So that was the point that I mentally quit the corporate world and decided to become an entrepreneur. And it did take me a couple of years to formally get out of it. But that was what triggered me out of the corporate world, deciding that having those trust relationships in my life and that deep intimacy. And it didn't mean I didn't work hard. It just meant that I could control the venue a little bit better. So that's actually what triggered me out of the corporate world. That coupled with, I really did have the expression to see the market forces eyeball to eyeball, rather than having it abstracted and just running large, big, stodgy companies. And everybody's different. You do what you need to do. But for me, I needed to taste the market and know whether I was adding value or not. And that's what set me on the entrepreneurial journey.
And the entrepreneurial journey, I spoke to a lot of entrepreneurs, and there's always this, what's the expression, perhaps scratching of the itch. And that's something that rolls over, whether it's something they're curious about, something that they're passionate about, or something that someone said to them and it's landed with them with this idea that, ends up being a 5-year project or something like that. So when you made that choice and you've stepped out of the corporate world and that sort of way and running, when you reflect now, when was the moment that you can recall going, I've made the right choice here, we're off, we're going? When did that momentum in stage 2 of your career, if you like, start?
It actually happened on a walk with my wife. And I was going around lamenting the misery of what was going on. And my wife stopped me, grabbed me by the shoulders and says, just do it. When are you going to make the jump? There's never going to be a perfect time. And so the following week is when I resigned. And I instantly knew I'd made the right decision. And there was a number of failures in there. I've founded or co-founded like 51 businesses. 19 of them have failed. I mean, I've had more failures than I've had successes. And I think that we skip over that failure is an integral part of the learning experience. We just need to learn to fail very efficiently. And we're not going down that rat hole now, but it is a lot of the zigzag concept of learning to guardrail very carefully our failures, making sure that we don't get off in the weeds and die in the process. So I think embracing failure is an integral part is just a key part of success.
Wonderful. I was very fortunate. I had a mentor in the coaching space, maybe 10 years ago now, maybe slightly less than that, say to me when I started a new job, I was wide-eyed, super fresh, and it was somebody I'd known across my career. And I said, right, I've got all these resources, I've got these ideas, now what? And they were like, fail quickly. Go out there and fail. Yeah, that's right. And I was like, huh? And that was, I remember it was one of the first times someone said that to me, and it stuck with me. And I guess I'm curious now too, you talked about being a parent yourself now. Obviously that changes things for a lot of people, going through that experience. And obviously it was a shift for you, within 18 months there. So again, being more reflective, and wiser, now having been a parent for a while, when you look back, what was that journey like, trying to navigate career number 2 and being a parent at the same time? Because it's not easy. And I think, again, a lot of people on the outside present this veneer that they've got it all figured out. And it's the opposite of going, you bounce from one calamity to the next. So how did you navigate that?
My philosophy on that, and I cover this in Zigzag Principle a lot too, is I don't believe in the fundamental concept of balance, of marching line of balance. Oh, I'm up at 7 and then I have breakfast and then I read the paper and then I don't believe in that concept and getting a lot done. I believe in living to extremes out of balance. So in our family life and with my relationships, I'd go extreme. I'd work my guts out so hard I'd about die. And then I'd come back across and spend a week with the family in a really fun vacation or something. And then I'd, again, very pressed, go do my responsibility. So balance to me with family has been crossing the line of balance as frequently as possible, but doing it to extremes rather than just marching to this cadence. I think the other aspect with family is realizing, and I've got 5 sons, and then I've raised a couple of Sherpa kids, quasi-raised a couple of Sherpa kids, and I've come to I talk a lot on family structures and stability, and I think we got to realize what are the critical impasse points in the child's life. We don't have to sit around and watch them like poop every time. That's creepy. It's like, what are the critical times you need to be there that really impact bedtime, morning time as they leave, and then give real full attendance then, real meaningful attendance then, and then you can go off and do this other meaningful stuff.
So again, I guess looping back to now starting the author thread in your life, I guess similar to being an entrepreneur, I'm at very early stages of writing a book, and it kind of just comes out of you. You start and then you go, oh, I'm going to talk about this and I'm going to talk about that. And I think, again, quite naively, a lot of people go, I'm going to write a book, or writing a book, how hard can it be? And, you're obviously a very successful author and you've experienced the challenges, shall we say, of going on that writer's journey. So just talk us through that a little bit, because I know I want to get onto the book now, but I'm really curious as to how we got to that, because writing is not easy.
No, it's not. It isn't. And I'd never discourage anyone from writing a book. If you have a book and you please write it and get out. It's never been easy, but I will tell you, it's one of the most complicated things that I actually end up doing. In my business books, I would from zero create $1 million business as part of the test case in it. Creating the business is the easy part. It's writing the book is actually the really difficult part, and it's actually getting it out there. So please, if you got a book in it, do it. There's nothing more meaningful to get you credibility and to give you. It's the ultimate business card. Did you want to hear how I first became an author? Is that what you were poking at, Kevin?
Yeah, I've noticed already these little threads where one domino's gone and it's rolled onto the next project and next aspect of your life. So where did that first thread come from, where you went, I'm going to write a book? What did that look like?
Well, it's actually quite an entertaining story, and not what you would have thought, because I never had any inclination or interest in becoming an author. Actually, in one of my companies that had become very successful, a hostile takeover occurred with one of my dearest friends and business partners. And it so put me on the floor. I shut all my other businesses down and was just moping around. I was just like not in a good spot. I mean, it really was, I probably should have been institutionalized at that point, because it really whacked my brain. And my little brother, a remarkable man, and my wife came to me and said that you're driving us all crazy. And so you've got to do something. How about you freak us all out on how you've now, at that point, I'd done like 28 or 30 companies, and says, this process, you go to write a book of how you create companies, write that. Everyone will buy it. And I thought, well, sure. And so I spent 2 years, 3 days, 9 months, 2 years, 3 months, 9 days writing my first book. It was called Bootstrap Business, that outlined my process for creating companies. And at the point, it was like, oh my gosh, no one's going to buy that book. But it was right at the precipice of when the lean startup movement was occurring. And lo and behold, not only did it get picked up, there were a lot of even large educational institutions that started using that silly book as their textbook. And so that accidental, terrible mishap in my life propelled me into becoming an author. And then once I had that itch, some of this content was so important, I couldn't hold it back. I could not hold it back no matter what. And so that's what propelled me into the author space.
And I guess the journey, even from Zigzag, which is now over a decade old as a book, and you've now obviously gone and published your latest book. Writers evolve, as they go through their journey, because people change over their life, and obviously parts of their life become apparent. And I guess that's the thread that leads us into where the latest book came about, because there were parts of your life that you weren't even as an adult aware of until quite late on. So just take us on that journey of, I guess, discovery, but also then the effects of what that's had in your life.
Yeah. Well, I think on the public persona, I was looked to a lot. A lot of people count me mentor and father, and I'd come out with this really rich content. But what fuels you to create 51 businesses? I mean, seriously, that's got to root back to something. And it's more than just entrepreneurship. And at the age of 53 years old, my youngest brother had a fun little party. We used to always call him the milkman's son. And I really regret that now, actually. But so he had this big DNA reveal where he took an ancestry test, and it came out in the test as he read the results in front of the crowd that he was half Jewish. There's no Jewish heritage. So our first thought was, oh gosh, mom died really young. Mom, what were you doing? Were you having? We went through these horrific scenarios, all the way from rape. And then one by one, as my brothers and I took the test, it was discovered that we weren't full brothers. And so at that point, you then go to your 93-year-old father and say, Dad, Mom. But Mom was so religious and tight that way that we couldn't imagine it. So finally, we went to our father, and his comment was, you caught us. This was going to be the first order of business in the next life. And he said, I'll talk about this once and only once, and then we're never speaking it ever again. And so he then went on, to share this remarkable story that indeed the man that I worshiped, the man that I was attempting to get his approval, the smartest man that I've ever met in my life, indeed was not my biological father. And that then, Kevin, did completely disassemble my life and take me on this beautiful journey of understanding of self-love, self-acceptance, and understanding truly what I was and what this hidden rocket fuel had been all these years that had propelled me into this entrepreneurship kind of juggernaut that I had become.
So I'm really curious because, again, doing the deeper reading behind the scenes, the immediate, I guess, response, you had to go through some quite challenging scenarios to kind of tick off what wasn't the case. And I guess the deeper meanings behind why your dad wasn't your biological dad and the stories even associated with that. I think most children would look up to both their parents, and I speak for myself as I can look up to my dad with that kind of hero mentality, and to have had that almost lost, but then some of the threads of that actually almost entrench it even more. That wonderful story of why he did what he did. For me, I look at that and it had a huge impact on me just reading it. So I can't even imagine being in your shoes, what that felt like finding that out.
My father indeed was a god, not only to us, but everyone else. But I think that the richness of the story, as we gave it time to marinate, even made him more significant and more real. The reality, and I think what you're looking for is it turned out that retinoblastoma was indeed genetic. So if he and my mom had got married and had kids, he had chosen to sterilize himself, and then so that he would not pass on that mutation. And my mom and dad broke up. Mom used to say that they had broke up, and it's the only time she'd ever seen him cry. Dad was like Data from Star Trek, no emotion at all. I mean, you take the most non-emotional man in the earth you've ever met, 10 times it with brilliance, and that was Dad. And so Dad had made the decision not to have children. They had broke up, and then they got back together. And it turns out that a doctor from back east, Columbia, and then Johns Hopkins had moved out to Utah and was practicing donor conception, a new modality. And it was nefarious. It was illegal, keeping in mind my dad was the county attorney. It was illegal, Kevin. Okay, so Dad would have went to jail over this. Number two, and even more significant, it was excommunicatable in the religion. the religion that my parents practiced was Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints, or Mormon. So it was excommunicatable from the religion, which is pretty significant gravity in their culture that they would do that. So when they did this, I became one of the first donor-conceived kids, one of the very early donor-conceived kids through this nefarious procedure. And then they promptly told no one. No one. It was the ultimate secret which was maybe the most remarkable part of the story is our family's a bunch of gossipers on my dad's side. No one knew. It was a secret they kept. And I was the remarkable first product of this love story of ultimate desire to have children and bringing me into this world in this fashion.
I'm curious more now because it's such an endearing experience in terms of thinking as any child looking up to their parents. We always talk about, and in my day job, I speak to a lot of parents and trying to get across the concept of sacrifice and what that looks like. And I guess it's interesting that you had that rocket fuel even without that knowledge that you didn't get until later on. And yet actually for a lot of people, the knowledge of the sacrifice that their parents make for them is the reason that they're propelled forwards. And I know for you, having a lot of the challenges around the approval and, like you mentioned there, perhaps not the most emotionally dynamic father figure when you were growing up. Where did that come from in terms of when you've got the approval driving you, but actually not knowing what's around the corner? I guess I'm getting at, now you know it all. What was the root cause of some of those amazing experiences you had earlier on?
Well, I think, all of us are really 5-year-olds running around in adult bodies, Kevin. And oftentimes we try acting like we're these big fancy pants adults when we're really just raging 5-year-olds. And quite frankly, I had a lot of daddy issues. I love my dad. I respect it, but I crave so badly to have the words spoken, "I am proud of you." When I wrote Zigzag Principle, I got exhausted with my dad introducing all the brothers. Brett, he's a world famous doctor. Oh, John Hopkins, Vaughn, an attorney. My youngest brother, he designs those beautiful structures. Richard, I don't know what he does, And so that was kind of the relationship. So I wrote Zigzag Principle. Dad, I can say I'm an author. He read the book, and his comment back was, well, it was an adequate book, but there's some grammatical problems on page 167. It's the number 5 best-selling book in the whole U.S. And, so that was the relationship. I yearned so badly to have Dad say, "I'm proud of you." But, and I think that what you're rooting back to was oftentimes secrets and things happen to carry weight as much as the beautiful part of the love story. We've got to acknowledge that in grandeur even more. But also, I think that when we keep secrets and we hold energy and we hold back, it also has implication. Even as a young child, as a deep empath, I knew something was off. I went to my mother when I was 12 years old and said, "I'm weird. I do not fit in here. Am I adopted or something? I mean, something's not right, Mom. What's going on?" And her comment was, "Oh, no. You're my son. You're my son. You're absolutely my son." But the full truth wasn't shared. And I think they made the right decision, but we've got to understand that when we hold deep, deep rooted secrets, particularly, about our origin stories, it does carry weight and matter. And so when I discovered this at the age of 53, my complete world collapsed. I mean, it completely fell apart. And I went through every emotion, all the way from raging anger to mopey suppressive. And it took me 4, 5, 6 years. That's why I was on sabbatical, not writing, not all my companies, resigned from boards even, to get back to moderate middle as what's the truth in this. And the truth in it is this beauty, amazing, more remarkable love story than even it was before, but also let's stand in integrity, truth, and understand what our challenges are. My favorite quote now has become Oliver Wendell Holmes: "For this side of simplicity, I would not give a fig. For simplicity on the other side of complexity, for that I would give my life." And I think what I've really come to now is simplicity on the other side of complexity. For the first time, actually having real internal peace and learning to love myself and and realizing, oh my gosh, this was just another amazing experience that I got to participate in life.
So I'm going to ask you a very selfish question, because still navigating the journey of losing a parent, how do you obviously only spoke about it once with your father, but obviously didn't get a chance to speak about it with your mum. What's the conversation both internally with yourself, but also with your brothers, of how you've managed to square that experience away when you've not been able to have that conversation?
Well, I think it has to end up becoming internal a conversation. My mother died very young of breast cancer, which kind of ripped, our soul apart. And with my brothers and I, we all agreed as this came down that we would give each other latitude to handle the situation in our own way. I ran right towards it. I ran right into the flame, quoting Parker Palmer, facing our fears, fierce with reality. My other brothers handled it differently. I had one brother that quarantined and isolated, another brother that ran it, another that just chose to kind of ignore it. And I think we've got to give latitude. It has added complications in our family. It would be unrealistic to think that it wouldn't. But at the end of the day, we're all accountable for our own destinies, and we all get to choose our own path. And so I don't think there's a right nor wrong. I just think that we all got to face these challenges as how we will.
So you've gone through that, you've made sense of it, and you've found peace, which is very humbling to hear. And I think for a lot of people who would not be comfortable talking about these things, and perhaps sit with that inner turmoil for the rest of their life, I think it's fantastic to hear that. But now getting to a point where you've managed to square a lot of that away in your mind, you've now gone, right, let's put pen to paper. Let's move forwards with this, and let's create something to share that with other people. So take us on the journey of putting your latest book together.
Yeah, the book is called Blindside: A Journey of Faith, Identity, and Healing. And it did take me 6 years. I mean, to put in context, I rewrote Zigzag Principle Revision 2 in a long weekend. So it was a long, arduous process. I hired a New York Times investigative reporter for a year to make sure we got the facts right. And it was very cathartic. It was healing, but it was also, I think, in some ways liberating to actually come out with this. And, people ask, why did you do this? Why would you bring it so intimate? And I think I really got 3 parts to that. The first is so that my children can know, because I open up very vulnerable, even about the time I considered taking my own life at one point. So my children, my grandchildren, my grandchildren could have a model to understand that, no, their ancestors went through these complicated things, and you have the ability to also navigate the challenges. The second reason I wrote the books is this story will be told. It's too juicy not to tell over and over. Matter of fact, there's already been some, made for TV series that want to and not willing to do that. I wanted to control the narrative and get it accurate and proper in the balanced middle. But then I think the third and the primary reason that I wanted the story told is an example that we can face our fears, that we can go towards them, and that we can get through this and come on the other side and live a life in flow rather than a life in force. Prior, I was living a life in force. And now my personal values, my family values, my public persona values, and my wealth values are aligned. So for the first time, I've actually learned to really love myself and be at peace. And in the quiet moments, laugh at my own bad jokes and enjoy the private moments.
So what does balance look like for you now? Because I think I work in a startup, and I think the novelty of the concept of balance is something that I think a lot of people perhaps aspire for, but it feels like something on the horizon, almost like a mirage. So now you're at that place, and you've gone through this journey, this roller coaster, to a point where you've tried to find balance. How do you keep it in check? How do you maintain it?
So I'm going to respond to that in 2 ways. The first I already alluded to is I give myself permission still to go out of balance. I mean, this last week I've taught an intensive. Man, I didn't sleep for 2 or 3 days. I've got a whole series of interviews and podcasts the next day and a half. But then I'm going for a week with my wife, and I'll probably sleep 10, 12 hours a day, non-apologetically. So I think it's okay to live your life out of balance. Just don't stay there. Cross back and forth to it. We already talked about that concept. But I think the second more significant is this structure that I built with my dear friend called Scott Ford called cycle of force, cycle of flow. And that is to get the values in alignment. Make sure that your personal values, and most people haven't even thought, what are my personal values or my personal ethos? If you don't understand that, how are you going to live true to that? Then in your family or your tribe, what are your ethos or your core values there? We all have and understand the values in our public persona, our business or startup or whatever you're doing. But if that's out of balance with your wealth, which is wealth does not mean money, it means we are well, emotionally, mentally, spiritually well. How are you spending your time? So what I've discovered, and I'm purporting very strongly now, is private values, family values, public or your public facing business values in alignment with your wealth. And at that point, your life just naturally happens. Man, if I had been living this way prior, I would have had 115 businesses and 90% hit rate rather than 30% hit rate. And it just is so much easier and more joyful to operate. We know when to say no. We know when to say yes. And we can just set the rattlesnakes aside.
So I've got a couple more questions to kind of pull it all together. My first one is, knowing everything you now know, if you could go back to 10-year-old Rich and give him a message, what would you say?
Well, I'd go back, first of all, to the 5 or 6 or 7-year-old, and it would just simply be pure self-love and realizing that it's okay, even the mistakes, even the hurts. And I do. I love on my 5-year-old and my 7-year-old and my 10-year-old now, and actually father my own child. And I know that sounds kind of foo-foo, non-apologetically, but kindness and nurturing, and stop with all the guilt, stop with all the shame, stop with all of the negative self-babble, and just learn to love, kindly pat the little kid on the head and tell him it's safe and it's going to be okay. And so it's not a matter of going back. I actually virtually go back to that point. And that's been the very precipice of the healing work, Kevin. We all have got a 5, 7-year-old. That's where most of the trauma and it's not even bad. It's just challenges come, is that young child. Then we all have got a rowdy teenager in us. And we just need to, moderate and love those entities and not shame and guilt and starve them to death and beat them around. What solves many of our ills is just kindness to ourselves. Kindness to ourselves. I work now with some of the most, influential people, and that's what we all do. That's what we do is go to the 5 and 7-year-old. That's where most of the trauma occurs.
And then I guess taking the lessons from obviously your latest book into, and as I guess a final message for our audience, we have a really wide demographic ranging from probably 15, 16-year-olds all the way through to people in their 70s that listen to the show. And everyone's still trying to figure it out. We're all on this journey. So what would your message be to the adults listening who are thinking, I haven't got it figured out. I'm not sure what to do next. How do I find that balance? Where do I start? What would be your message to them?
Well, I think that there's different modalities that we can use, but I think the very precipice, please get to quiet time, whether it's meditation or breath work, a walk in nature, whatever it is, get to quiet time and give yourself, your soul, a chance to express. It's not good nor bad. Even the hard thing is just soul expansion. It's just soul growth. That's what it is. And so we really can't operate very cleanly in the true knowing of what we really are when we're in noise and jitter. So I beg you to give yourself a power hour. I now have an hour every day that it is sacred time. Nobody messes with it because it's my chance to get in tune of where I'm really at. And when we operate from that sense of knowing, man, the rest of it just happens so much easier. Because we're not jittery, just doing stupid things that causes more problems. It's the old adage of when you find yourself in a hole, the first thing to do is stop digging. Well, you don't know to stop digging until you listen to the quiet knowing of your soul. And it's the biggest challenge we have with technology and the noise in our world is we're not operating from a soul expression place. And that's coming from the engineer logic zigzag guy. Woo, didn't expect that one, did you?
Well, that's a wonderful way to put it all together, Rich. And I think, the book's fantastic. We'll make sure we link everything, both your website and your socials, in the notes below the video and the podcast, because there's so much wisdom in obviously the latest book and all the other work that you've done so far. And it's been really humbling to get to speak to you in person. And I'm really looking forward to see kind of where you go next on your journey, because it has been, I read it and went, wow. And I think it's amazing now to be able to, for loads of other people, to hopefully experience that over the coming weeks and months and years. So a huge thank you for your time today, and very much looking forward to following your journey moving forwards.
Well, thank you so much, Kevin. What is it like to be on the Rogue Monkey? I have a bucket list item. I've been on the Rogue Monkey, and just blessings to you and to your listeners. And I just wish you joy and happiness in your life.
Well, what a conversation that was. A huge thanks again to Rich for sharing some time with us. You can connect with Rich and find out more about both his books and everything else he's up to via the links in the show notes. We're going to be back very soon, as we are speaking in our next episode to a professional stuntman who's completed works recently on both the new Wicked and Gladiator 2 films. So be sure to stay tuned for that. Don't forget to hit subscribe however you're joining us today, as you'll be notified as soon as those episodes drop. Thanks again for joining us, and we hope you can join us again soon for another episode of the Road Monkey Podcast.